Welcome to this week's episode of Resisting the Dragon's Beast. We're going to be looking at the chapter entitled Freedom on page 179. And since we're talking about Braveheart in the introduction to this chapter, that's why my background is the William Wallace sword from that movie. I'm not going to read the whole introduction I've got laid out there. Just want to read the last two paragraphs. One soldier admits to William Wallace, fight against that, the huge British army. No. Soldiers shout in agreement, we will run and we will live. Wallace challenges, I fight and you may die. Run and you'll live at least a while. And dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance? Just one chance to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom. So, Peter, until 2020, would any of us have believed that freedom-loving people like us in America would so willingly have given up our freedoms?
I think it's very easy to underestimate, or rather to overestimate, how loud we are about what we think our freedoms are and how little we do about it. I just had this conversation in our Bible class where I said, pietism, or talk about the spiritual movement of pietism, less, and I think politically, there's a strain of pietism where people who like freedom and who read the Constitution, who have read about freedom, who might know one of the freedoms of the Bill of Rights, a lot about. But all it is bravado, and like, I'll know it when it comes, and then I'll do it when the day comes. But until then, I'm just gonna go along with everything.
Yeah,
and it's never advocating for freedom in a good way.
right. Yeah, we talked about this in our Bible study this morning on the same chapter. Just to think about, I asked the question, what kind of freedoms did we willingly forfeit? And you would think it's freedom-loving nations like America, France, Britain, Australia, and yet those were some of the worst countries with removing freedoms like a freedom of speech, freedom of mobility, the freedom to work, the freedom to choose whether you're going to be vaccinated or not, the freedom to worship, the freedom to gather, whether it's in a restaurant or a workplace, a public park, a hospital, a funeral. All of these freedoms that we so willingly gave up. And that was shocking to me.
Yeah, and in one respect, it was shocking, and at least for me, in another respect, it was like, well, that's kind of what we expected. Not to that degree, but I've seen people just bend over backward because we like the idea of authority, and if I can obey authority and I get the social points for my obedience. And I'm just giving up a little bit of this or a little bit of that particular thing, and we rationalize it away. That I don't think we love freedom as much as freedom as it is. I think we love the idea of freedom, which is just the idea that I get to do what I want. And when you're confronted with a superior force or some government official who puts on, then it's like, oh, I'll do that because all of a sudden that's what I want to do.
Yeah, and it can be a superior force, or it could just be guilt, because they're saying this is for the good of everyone else. And we'll get to that in a moment. Because they also quote, it is kind of interesting when, and I looked at it this way, I followed up the quote from William Wallace in Braveheart. The very next quote is from Barbie in Toy Story 3. But she says, authority should derive from the consent of the governed not from the threat of force. So, Peter, why is it important to remember that God's servant of the government is to be the protector of its citizens, not the custodian of its citizens?
Yeah, and that gets into the basic political philosophy behind, where our Constitution came from and the way that our government is set up. That when we're not talking about just government in a vacuum, we're talking about government here in this country, according to the way that it is constituted. And so, in that respect, that our Constitution begins with the people and giving their consent to this government, and the people then working together to create the constitutional rights of the people. It's a very strong 18th century idea, the kind of the social contract where the people give their consent and then they will submit to the government. But when we outsource our responsibility to the government and say that they are now the custodian of all this, as a Christian, that's giving up the stewardship of the things that are specifically your responsibility. It would be very easy to say, here's the easy way. The government will pay for the tuition to send my child to a private school. The government has already written it in my property taxes that and send my child there, and then I get basically daycare for 8-9 hours a day for all their youth, and the government is allowed to take custody of these children for the purpose of saying, don't worry, we'll take care of it. And not that this is always the case, but it definitely opens the door to ignoring our specific responsibilities as parents. And I'm sure you could, think of the other vocations, the other estates in life that are related to that, and kind of the same thing, where the church is told, well, you need to close, you can't gather in groups, you can't function as a church, and if we love the idea of obeying authority, then we're like, oh, look, the church has been deployed. No, the church should have been being the church all along, and don't share pictures of your empty sanctuaries when you should be gathering for worship.
Yep.
The government is not the custodian of the kingdom of Christ.
Yeah, you use the word stewardship. I would use the word vocation. That this is our vocation as citizens. When I asked this question in Bible study this morning, one of the ladies astutely said, God did not create us to be robots. Because if we just go along as the government is our custodian, there's no love. There's no forgiveness. We're just doing what we're told. And then I think of it this way, and this is probably why some pastors don't really care for this book, because I'm calling out Christian citizens, but also pastors, because I believe we have slowly transitioned to consider the government to be over the citizens rather than the government serving citizens. And you and I know this because we've talked about this with the youth confirmation class that I think we both use from Northwestern Publishing House. And I just covered this in class on Tuesday, studying the fourth commandment. And it talks about the role of the government, and it's that we are to serve the government. You and I changed the answers. They're a lot longer than the original answers. And I told them, you don't have to write all of this down. This is more of a reminder to me. But I said, the government serves us. That's what Romans 13 says. And I bring that up here because another pastor, he really liked the book, but he was surprised that I didn't start with this chapter on freedom. He was surprised that I started with Romans 13. Well, I have to establish Romans 13. The government is our servant. It's God's servant, so that we understand where the freedom comes from. It's not from the government. It's from God who gives us these freedoms. I quote C.S. Lewis. I want to read the longer quote, but then I just want to come back to the first sentence. This is on the bottom of page 181. Of all tyrannies, A tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep, his cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. They may be more likely to go to heaven, yet at the same time likelier to make a hell of earth. This very kindness stings with intolerable insult. To be cured against one's will and cured of states which we may not regard as disease is to be put on a level of those who have not yet reached the age of reason, or those who never will, to be classed with infants, imbeciles, and domestic animals. So I ask you, Peter, based on that quote, what do you learn from C.S. Lewis's quote, especially that first line? Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive.
You're just reading through that, and what you really understand is no matter the government, because every government is going to be distorted just in a different way. So let's not just go black hat, white hat with the communists are bad and America is good, but that every government is oppressive in its own way. And the tool they have is manipulating the conscience. And so if they automatically paint themselves as the ones who are being your helper, I'm here for your good, then that puts them in the position of being good. And if they are good, then therefore everybody, who has no particular insight, hasn't given a whole lot of thought to this, doesn't have an informed conscience from scripture, and only has their natural reason to guide what is actually good and not good, and what is my responsibility, then everybody else goes along with it. And if they have already chosen the high ground of the moral high ground of I'm doing what is good for you, then the only way to oppose that and say, well, I don't need that, first of all, and that, second of all, isn't for my good specifically, it automatically puts you in the defensive position in the argument, in the debate, in society, and then the power of society is on the side of good, because that's the instant rhetoric that this is a good thing, they're doing it for your good, and if you are doing something different, then you are other, you are less. You are the stranger, you are the anomaly, and it's the idea of what is it called? I think in the UK, maybe in Canada too, the tall poppy syndrome, or like crabs in the bucket is the idea from the Philippines and Indonesia, Australia, and the idea there is that the tall poppy is the one that gets cut down, and that if you have enough crabs in a bucket, you don't need a lid on the bucket. If you're catching crabs, you just put them in the bucket, and then they will pull each other down back into the bucket. If one tries climbing out, it's going to pull it back down. Fantastic song by Chaos. Got to look them up on YouTube. Crabs in a bucket. That'll get your morning off to a good start. But yeah, I think that's kind of the idea here, is manipulating the conscience on a society-wide level in order to enforce the idea that their oppression is inherently better than the individual taking responsibility for their own God-given responsibilities.
Yeah, and there, I just thought of this quote, and I could have fit it in the book here, of what Ronald Reagan said when he was president, the 9 most terrifying words in the English language: I'm from the government and I'm here to help. I think that fits in with what C.S. Lewis is saying. But I was thinking of this. I don't know, Peter, if you've ever read the DC Comics graphic novels or seen the cartoon movie adaptation, or I think it's most popular as a video game called the Injustice League. What it is, the premise is that, Superman and Batman don't kill. Even the Joker, as awful as he is, they won't kill the Joker. Well, the Joker sets up a scenario where Lois Lane, Superman's wife, is killed by the Joker, and it drives Superman insane, so much so in his anger and grief that he puts his fist through the Joker, obviously killing him. And then Superman in the goal to enforce peace at any cost, and he becomes like the ruler of the world. And he has other superheroes on his side, like Wonder Woman. And the whole idea is what C.S. Lewis is saying here. He's going to enforce peace, making sure that everything is good, but then there's no freedom. And then you've got Batman leading other superheroes against Superman and Wonder Woman and so forth, that even though there's going to be evil, there's going to be freedom. And I just think that's an interesting concept of Superman is trying to enforce good. And my associate, Pastor Klusmeyer, mentioned it in Bible study this morning before I used the Superman reference. He talked about that's how every nation in the world, the Chinese Communist government, the communist government, even Hitler and so forth, they all said, we are doing this for the good of the people. And then they did atrocious evils.
Mm-hmm. And even if hypothetically they were able to say this is the morally and ethically correct thing to do, and even if they had the perfect perception to understand what is morally and ethically correct in every circumstance, mere outward obedience without the heart, it lasts for a while. It may be of some worldly benefit, but it is of no spiritual benefit. But it's again manipulation of the conscience, where they want to say, well, here's the standard, and if you just live up to this, then you are good, and then you are off the hook. And you don't, if you live up to the standard of leading an active, healthy lifestyle, and we've got good example from Canada, I suppose. When I first moved to Canada, walking around the grocery store was a little bit different. First of all, everything has both English and French on it, which works really well because it just works really well on labels and such for reading it. But I was looking around, and it was very notable how much American junk food wasn't there. Not that I was especially interested in it, but it was noteworthy. And my hypothesis about it was basically the idea that I am responsible for taking care of myself, because if I eat poor food, it's going to impact my health, and my neighbor is paying for my health care. And so I want to live the best way that I can so that my neighbor doesn't have to pay for my heart attack and my stroke and all of my deleterious health effects. And what that is, it looks on the surface like it's good, but it totally eviscerates moral consciousness, and it totally exhausts moral willpower. Because now you drive into Canada. I love this part. You cross over in Detroit, you get through Detroit. Detroit is a beautiful city, and it's going to be a beautiful city for a long time. I will die on that hill. But you cross over from Detroit into Windsor, and you start seeing all these road signs, like every half a mile. Don't drive if you're tired. Take a break if you're tired. Don't drive drunk. Don't drive high. Here's the legal limit of 0.03. All these regulations, and the purpose is to totally drain, make people exhausted on a moral level of all the things that I have to do. And if I want to get off the hook from all the external inputs against, my obligations to society, then I can relieve myself of that by paying attention to the other guy. And if I tell him what he should or shouldn't not do, then I can bring some relief to myself that I have finally lived up to the standard. And I think in whether we're talking communism, fascism, or Americanism, whatever our system happens to be, who knows these days, it's a similar thing where they will use the conscience, and the rules and regulations will set up a social standard, a social expectation, and then say, as long as you live up to it, then you are okay. And I don't think it's not a coincidence that where you see the multiplication of laws and policies and regulations, that the vitality of the church just goes unless they're willing to speak up.
Yeah, and then we'll look at that in the next one. But yeah, just think of governments, again, thinking they're doing it for the best. And so what are they going to do? They're going to really fine smoking and so forth. And then, next is vaping. But you even have in places like New York where they're limiting how much, the big size of soda you can get. And again, they can say, well, this is for your benefit so that you're not having the diabetes and heart disease and so forth, or cancer from the smoking. But what they're doing, though, is they're taking away freedoms. And I mentioned this a little bit last week and touch on it some more here. I had just finished listening to and then watching One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And I think it's God's providence that I finished it to be able to talk about it here, because I think the whole premise of that book and then the movie, and then I watched the extras on the movie, was that the whole purpose with Randall McMurphy, Jack Nicholson's character, is he's in this place where everything is regimented and so forth. And Nurse Ratched, what's interesting is she was supposed to be played where the actress who plays her like she's a good person. She's believing she's doing good. But in reality, she's removing all the freedoms and she's actually a very evil person. This is exactly what we're talking about here. And then when the climax of the book and movie, Randall brings in some prostitutes, brings in alcohol and so forth. There's chaos all night long, all morning long. And he's going to escape with Chief, this guy that's like 7 foot tall American Indian, and he doesn't escape. And then the end of the movie, Randall McMurphy is lobotomized, and the key though is now he's peaceful. And that's what the government that is the beast out of the sea really wants from us as custodians. They just want peace. And to do that, they will remove freedoms.
Mm-hmm. And I think together with that, in practical application, this is where the reason, having more laws and more policies or taking away freedoms, even if it's a good thing, we don't need to drink half a gallon of soda with your Big Mac. We could probably all agree on that. That is a good thing. But when there's the rule, the external thing, that takes away my personal responsibility, that takes away my thinking. And then instead of me saying, oh, maybe I'll have a water instead, then it's, oh, I'll just do whatever they say, because now what's the next thing that I need to do? Because it lets me off the hook of my own personal moral responsibility. As well as the responsibility of making my own ethical choices that are my responsibility, even if somebody says that I'm making the wrong choice. Okay, then I'll make the wrong choice, and I will bear the repercussions of that choice. And hopefully, that's, in a sense, that is God's external tool of the law, His foreign work, where you come slamming up against a brick wall. I did the wrong thing, and now I have to own up to what I did. You're dealing with guilt. You're dealing with shame. You're dealing with a moral consciousness that gets deadened through the multiplication of external rules, laws, and policies.
So in our Bible study this morning, one of the ladies mentioned this quote from a movie. I wasn't able to find it when I was Googling it. Maybe one of our listeners can do it, because maybe she didn't quote it exactly, but she said it was a Christopher Lloyd character in some camp movie. And it was that even smart people have the constitutional right to do dumb things. Yeah, well, that was pretty applicable quote here. And in the middle of page 182, I call out leaders, but I hear especially pastors for going along with this. I say those within the media, businesses, universities, and even churches did not seem to stop to ask whether the suspension of civil liberties was right, justified, or necessary. These are leaders who have abdicated their role as the moral compass of public opinion. Not only have they abdicated that role, in many cases, they have sided with government and bureaucracy in promoting the invasion into private lives and the suspension of civil liberties. In there, think of Thomas Jefferson. I quote him at the end. He says, "The natural progress of things is for liberty to yield, and government to gain ground. And isn't it interesting that Thomas Jefferson says that at the beginning of our nation, knowing what's going to happen and where we are several hundred years later, that yes, our government is taking away our freedoms.
I think Benjamin Franklin had a similar quotation that those who would give up freedom in order to secure safety deserve neither safety nor freedom, safety or security, something like that. And it's a similar idea that that an organization is not going to have the nuanced understanding and the personal responsibility of individuals. If we just get all of the personal responsibility and we outsource it, then it just becomes a competition of living up to the rules. And if you've ever read Animal Farm, the rules on the barn can change, and it doesn't take too much. We get deceived into thinking. Same as Benjamin Disraeli, who came back after his meeting with Adolf Hitler, and he's like, "I have secured peace for our time," and that's like what, 1938 or 1939, and that lasted all of a couple months, maybe. The idea that if we just give in and if we just go along with it, then we can tell ourselves we're doing the right thing, and it's also going to be beneficial. When sometimes it is neither the right thing nor beneficial.
So with that, then, Peter, should Christians willingly hand over their freedoms, or should they zealously guard those freedoms?
That's a fantastic question. Kind of turns on the concept of freedom. As a Christian, I am the bondsman of Jesus Christ. That I want to, in all that I am, I want to have my confession in word and deed be something that confesses my faith in Jesus, the faith that we all share. And so when we're talking about Christian freedom, I will give up my freedom for a time if the use of my freedom would be a stumbling block. But that is a different understanding from when we're talking about civic freedom and secular freedom. When we're talking about like governmental freedom. That's where Christians have a responsibility to stand up for their freedoms, because the freedom that is preserved to us, like in the Constitution, is there for the good of the citizens, and it's part of the contract that literally constituted our nation. And we shouldn't import this Christian idea of I'm going to give up my freedom in service to others. At the same time, the Christian citizen should say, well, even if it isn't affecting me personally and individually right now, I have a responsibility to my fellow citizen to stand up when this particular freedom is being infringed upon. And that's where, you've probably heard it like 5 times already. Even the basics of, if you read the preamble to the Constitution and the First Amendment, the first of the 10 Bill of Rights, and look at it. I asked in Bible class one time, I think I probably told this story, like, what is the First Amendment? There are 5 freedoms in the First Amendment, and crickets, and somebody's like, the right to keep and bear arms. No, that's the second. If we don't know these things, how are we going to be a good citizen? Good citizenship requires knowing these things, then holding the government to it.
One of the things that I really learned as I was writing this chapter is to think of our freedoms as possessions, so something that we can hold on to, much like a home or property, vehicle, or stuff. And just like the government cannot claim our property or home through eminent domain, they can't claim our freedoms in the same way.
I got something for you on that. They can.
Well, they can.
Citizens United, Eminent Domain. I think that was, I want to say 2008. I'd have to go back and look at that. But go ahead.
Well,
it's frustrating. I get it.
I liken it to, since I was sick a week and a half ago, and I was trying to find something to watch. I finished binge watching some comedy show, Parks and Rec. And so I started watching Yellowstone. And I brought it up in Bible study today, and afterwards, one of the guys said, I can't believe 2 of the people that I love most, me and then someone someone else who's in Bible say, I can't believe the people I love and respect the most, they watch that show. So yeah, it's not great. There's nothing really redeeming about it. But anyhow, in that show, Yellowstone, you've got the main character, John Dutton, and where I am in season 3, is he's trying to protect his Yellowstone ranch from this big conglomerate of people owning this business, and they want to put in a ski resort in Montana, and then bring in an airport, and they're putting pressure on the governor to seize John Dutton's Yellowstone ranch by eminent domain. They said, well, willing to pay, 10,000 acre, so they get $5 million, but he doesn't want it. He doesn't want the money. He wants the property as a legacy to pass on to his children. And that's the key, is that these are rights that come to us from God and not the government. And there I quote the Declaration of Independence on page 183, just to make you proud, Peter. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And there I say, if the government can suspend its citizens' rights anytime it deems necessary, then they're not rights. Then they are permissions.
Yes. And I had a footnote somewhere in there earlier in the book that talked about the difference between the American Bill of Rights and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Privileges, where the Canadian Charter basically says that we grant these privileges to the people, but those privileges can be suspended at when we deem fit.
Well, that's important that you bring that up, because was it just a week or two ago, one of the prime ministers in Canada said in a speech talking about transgenderism that there are no parental rights in Canada. He said those exact words. And that would make sense, because they're not rights in Canada, they're privileges.
Yep. And it takes a village to raise a child, and don't worry, we'll take care of it for you. We'll make sure that we've got $10 daycare for the entire nation, no matter how much it costs. And we'll provide breakfast and lunch and even after school care and supper if they need it at the school. And all it is letting parents off the hook, and nothing good happens when the one with responsibility is let off the hook. Back to the eminent domain thing, just to interrupt there. It was the 2005 decision, Kelo versus City of New London. If you look that up on Wikipedia.
I thought it was.
Yeah, 2005. I was a little bit off there. Citizens United had to do with campaign finance reform, which is an entirely different wormhole. But Kelo versus City of New London, 2005, that eminent domain, where the Supreme Court basically said on a federal level that eminent domain is permissible.
Yeah. And there may be reasons to do this, again, for the good of the population, but then you're hurting individuals. And so you got to be very careful about this, where the government cannot suspend rights. It's actually illegal for it to do so, just like, when you think of the 7th, 9th, and 10th commandments, you and I, as Christian citizens, are called to protect the property and means of income of our next door neighbor, of our family members, and so forth. And when the government comes in and tries to take away our possessions, our property, and our freedoms, then we are called on by God in those 3 commandments to resist the government, because it's not legal what they did during COVID to suspend those rights of, free speech, freedom to gather, freedom to worship, and so forth. They suspended our rights for the good of everyone. That's what they said, but they actually don't have the right to do so.
That's exactly correct. And even when we get down to the nitty gritty of the First Amendment, freedom of religion and the right of freedom of assembly, if they declare martial law and everything is shut down and the law is applied equally across the board, then everything can be closed. But if you start carving out, even one exception, then that opens the door to say, well, they don't have a constitutional right to be operating their 7-Eleven or their Costco or their liquor store, whatever you name it. But we do have a constitutional right to worship. So even if people are uncomfortable gathering together, I'm going to show up. We're going to have the doors open, and we're going to have worship service available, because this is something that we need to do in order. Not that I, want to be a test case. Who wants to be in the news as a, where's the Alliance Defending Freedom are they gonna come through for that on you, for you on that topic? But there is the responsibility that we have to be informed about what our rights actually are, and to be more thoughtful, not just say, well, the governor decreed this, whether he has the right to or not, and so therefore we're going to take the easy path. But rather to say, well, I have a responsibility to my fellow citizens and to my children that we exercise these freedoms, because otherwise it's just a freedom on paper.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and then with that, I quote Ronald Reagan on page 184. Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on to them to do the same. Or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States, where men were free. We are called upon to protect our freedoms. And there, I think about my grandfather, my grandpa Parcham, that I didn't learn this until the wake, the day before his funeral. I knew he had been in the Army. I saw the picture of him when he was a young soldier, but he was like many of that greatest generation, didn't talk about it at all. And I learned that he was in the Battle of the Bulge. And then I just learned from my aunt when I was texting her this week to ask her about it. She said, yeah, he was in a tank that got hit, and the guy next to him was killed in the tank. So my grandfather, like so many others, they fought and bled. Some died to protect and provide our freedoms. And for us to just willy-nilly give over our freedoms that these people died for is to treat this frivolously. And then to think of it scripturally, think of Esau. How do we teach the story of Esau with his birthright? What does he do? He trades it for a bowl of lentil soup. And that's what we do with our freedoms here. Take our freedom about going to work, going to worship, whatever it was, and then you hand us some pre-COVID money. You give us access to, we can stream our Hulu, we can eat our Hot Pockets, we can just hang out at home. And I mentioned this in Bible study a while ago. I said, this would not have happened 100 years ago. It probably would even have happened 20 to 30 years ago when we didn't have the internet and we weren't so easily placated. But because we could just have food delivered to us, because we could have anything on our phone and Wi-Fi and the streaming services, we were placated. You would know, you were the one that brought it up from that book. The drug that people were giving out.
Soma.
Yeah.
In Brave New World.
Yeah, you were the one that referenced that in this book. That's what we were giving Soma. This wouldn't have happened 20 or 30 years ago because there was nothing to do. You had to get out and do stuff. But because everything had been set up, so now we're placated. But no, we need to, the whole point is we need to be protecting these freedoms, like Reagan said, so we can hand those freedoms on to our children. Otherwise, we're just going to tell them stories about what it once was like.
Yeah. And I guess the interesting part for me, like, as I've been doing visits today, listening to, I pulled up like 3 or 4 different episodes from Pastor John Hine on the RWJ Daily podcast. And whenever I find audio from him, I put on the podcast. And what would be interesting for me when you're saying that this wouldn't have happened, 50 years ago or even 30 years ago, is that culturally, 50 years ago was the kind of cultural peak of cultural Christianity in America, and 30 years ago was the peak of our little church body. That the question that I've got is, what's the relationship between your Christian faith, the Christian faith that we all share, and a sense of individual responsibility? And I would propose that Christianity is, I mean, obviously, yes, it is individualized. It is a personal faith, but it is not a private faith. That what Jesus did for all people applies to you individually and personally, and that we go before our Lord. I confess that I have sinned against you in thought, word, and deed. Individual, personal, but it isn't private where you just get to pick and choose what you want to believe. And so coming from the direction of some sense of a cultural Christianity, bringing along with it the sense of individual responsibility and vocation and stewardship, versus the other side where the government comes at it from the point of the law to say we are going to just democratize all of this, we are going to socialize all of this, where the responsibility is on all of us to make sure that we don't kill grandma. And I would say from what I've seen, and I think there's good examples in the 20th century, is that when you have that non-individualizing of responsibility, that plays right into the sinful flesh that says, I am off the hook. I have no need of a savior. I have no personal responsibility because this is all of it, all of us, and we're all in it together. And even to the point where I will give up my own flesh and blood because it takes a village and I'm tired. And and that's kind of the interesting thing, that when you look at the messaging, whether it was related to COVID or other societies in the 20th century, the messaging is, we are doing this for your good. And this is the rule for you to follow. And that it rises when that sort of idea really rises when the idea of Christianity, Christian individual responsibility is in the decline.
Yeah, and for us to think of in our Lutheran worship, that individual versus corporate worship, just think of the creeds. That one Sunday we will say the Apostles' Creed, I believe in God the Father. And then the next week we say the Nicene Creed, we believe in God the Father. It's, one is a personal faith, the Apostles' Creed, but then the other one is corporately, we believe this. And so, yeah, it is what we do individually, but then also what we do corporately, both as citizens also. And then that kind of leads to the last question we can talk about today, Peter, is how does the beast out of the sea use fear to turn people away from the security of God?
Fantastic question. It proposes an answer to fear. And it says fear is only limited to your life here. So you need to be fearful for your life, and don't worry, we will take care of your life. I think there's two elements there where it compresses the fear, where we ought to have a fear of facing the one who could throw both body and soul into hell. And we ought to have a fear of death as the understanding that death is the payment for sin. And that is turned around into, we will take care of you, and we will give you, and we will make it socially acceptable for you to decide when and how you make your exit from this world, which is where you see the progression of curtailing both ends of life. Whether I am, there's abortion for the sake of the freedom of the mother to do whatever it is that she wants to do instead. And also the freedom of those to travel to a different country, or just call the maid if you live in Canada, the medical assistance in dying, and that those deaths aren't classified as suicides in their statistics. There's lies, damn lies, and statistics, but those deaths are classified as anything else, not labeled as suicide. And so the beast out of the sea says, we will make it so that you don't have to be afraid ever. And then we will make it so that the one thing you should be most afraid of that is unavoidable, death, besides taxes, the one thing that is unavoidable as the thump of God's law, we will make it now socially acceptable for you to just push the button whenever you want, and you can be in control. Did God really say? No, he didn't. We get to say, and then you get to say.
Yeah. And there I say that we have, again, abdicated our roles by giving things over to the government they don't need to have. We've given over education. That's our parental role. And what do we've done? We've said, here are our kids, 3, 4, 5 years old. You train them all the way up from that little age all the way up to the public university. We've abdicated our role as taking care of our elderly, our sick, of providing for the poor, about immigrants, medicine, healthcare, everything. We've just said, here, government, here's an issue, here's some kind of problem, you take care of it. And what does it do then is we see this in the fulfillment of Revelation 13, that the government takes more and more control, and then it doesn't just stay there. It then leads people to worship the beast out of the earth, which is the pagan church. And so now you can see our government is focusing people on worshiping climate change. It's the same old religion of, say, the Canaanites that the Israelites were fighting against. They are forcing people, encouraging them at least with abortion. It's the same religion of Molech that the Canaanites were dealing with, of killing the unborn or killing their children and sacrificing them to this god. It is getting people to worship their self and sexuality. It's the same religion of Baal and Asherah, these same gods of the pagan church from 3,000, 4,000 years ago. It's the same thing that we're seeing in our own nation as the government takes more and more control, and they're not morally neutral. They then are forcing people to worship a different beast, the beast out of the earth. And then those two beasts together are getting people to worship the great dragon of the devil.
And at every point where natural law would intervene or the conscience would intervene, we give it a sanitization and say, well, it's medical care. If you're feeling uncomfortable in your own skin, it's not because of your conscience, it's because you're actually a girl inside, and even though you were born as a boy. That's where natural law would intervene, and you would have to confront the reality that I feel uncomfortable and I don't know why. And the conscience, even with assistance in dying, assisted suicide, and they'll give it a new name that sounds pleasant and flowery, that you did it your way, right? Even with that, they give it the sanitizing thing of, well, it's science and it's healthcare, and it's always this promise that you get to decide your own fate. And it's a delusion that people believe until it's too late.
Yeah,
and that delusion, yeah.
Yeah, and talking about delusion, and that leads into this, it was brought up in Bible study this morning too, that again, think of the way language is changed. And I don't know exactly which state this is, but it's coming. In one state, it'll be reaching the others, and then federally, that now they are defining child abuse as you refuse to allow your child to have an abortion. You refuse to allow your child to have what they term, again, talking about changing of terms, of medically assisted, gender affirming care, which what we know is, a sex change, child abuse. That's real child abuse. Killing a child through abortion is real child abuse, but our government is changing those terms to make it so now a good conservative Christian parent who refuses to go along with the sins of the flesh and the sins of the world, that is termed child abuse. We'll wrap it up here, but I want to wrap it up with
that started just one last little bit that started at least on the gender side in the modern era back in about 2009, 2008, when President Obama changed Title IX, which was to protect women's sports, changed the terminology in Title IX from female sex to female gender. And that just that was one way that opened the doors to say, well, your gender doesn't have to match up with your body, that your gender is fluid. And And it's just Gnosticism reborn that says who I am inside may or may not match up with who I am outside. And the Christian church has had an answer to that for ages. And so we shouldn't be shy about these things.
Yeah. So I'll wrap it up with two quotes on page 185. One is from Senator Amidala from Star Wars. She says, "So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause." And I think we see that in our nation with the very first question I asked about, could you see that freedom-loving people like Americans would so easily give up our freedoms? Yeah, we did, with thunderous applause. And the last quote I'll end with is from, again, Ronald Reagan, who said it well: "Government's first duty is to protect the people, not run their lives. And it is part of our vocation to remind the government of what it is and what is their duty, and also what is not their duty." So we'll wrap it up here. We look forward to seeing all of you, Lord willing, next week as we continue on this chapter on freedom.